a phrase that's kind of obsessed me for about 5 years, or just a sentence really, is this phrase, now I am really awake. Now I am really awake. I've thought about it quite a bit, and I've kind of used it a few times, you know, when I'm making something that approximates the condition of art, whatever that means, or just as a kind of placeholder for some thoughts really. And I thought I'd just run through some ideas around it for myself, really rehearse why that phrase is so interesting to me. I mean, it really comes from, I mean, the first time I heard it, and I was so affected by it, was this documentary I saw on TV about 5 years ago, maybe, something like that, about this guy called Clive Wearing, who is I think he was a musician actually. There's bits of it on YouTube. Actually, if you're watching this on YouTube, I'll put it in the tag, so he's probably somewhere in the related videos bar at the side. Yeah, Clive Wearing he was a musician, and he suffered some kind of brain injury, or maybe a disease or something. Anyway, he had some kind of brain damage, and it had a very specific effect. It didn't affect his intelligence, you know, he had quite a high IQ. It didn't affect lots of his ability to experience emotions and to carry out all kinds of quite sophisticated cognitive tasks. But what he couldn't do was lay down new memories. He was kind of locked into a 5-second memory. So he could, he had perfect memory for everything that happened prior to this, him being struck down by this thing. But he couldn't lay down any new memories, which meant that all his experiences were constantly new to him. So he was married, his wife, who was really suffering under the strain, I think. Every time his wife left the room and then walked back in again, it was as if he hadn't seen her for years and years. As if he hadn't seen her since since he'd been struck down in that way. So he'd greet her each time with these fantastic, effusive welcomes, tearful welcomes of reunions. Even though, as I say, she'd just stepped out the room to make a cup of tea or something. Or sometimes even if he just turned around, he just turned around, not looked at her for a few seconds, and the memory of her had gone from his short-term memory, but hadn't gone into his long-term memory, which is what we need for his kind of ongoing consciousness in that way. And he turned back, and there she is, and again it would be like she just appeared out of nowhere after his prolonged absence, and again there'd be tearful welcomes. So this poor woman and this poor man, of course, are having to go through these endless reunions 40 or 50 times a day. And of course there's lots of things he can't do, he can't, because he can't put down a chain of new memories. It's just endless, what the things he can't do. Although of course lots of his stuff has been preserved. He can speak perfectly functionally, he's learnt language and grammar and syntax long time before his accident or whatever it was, so he can speak perfectly lucidly, which does say something, I think, about where that stuff comes from. Clearly we're not drawing that stuff from long-term memory. And he can play music really well. He can't remember lots of things about it, and if he's got a piece of sheet music in front of him, he can't remember consciously the first page whilst he's playing page 3 or whatever, but he can play it perfectly. There's a constant stream. It's like one thing that's happening out of time almost, and he's playing music. It's really great. Anyhow, the reason why that relates to this phrase, now I am really awake, is that he also keeps journals. And he showed one of his journals to the camera, and this journal just kind of narrates what it's like to live in that kind of constant moment of awakening. And basically this journal is just full of lines and lines and lines of the phrase, now I am really awake, or some variation on that. This is the first moment of my awakening. Now, underlined, I am really awake. Now, double underlined, I am really awake. And he can't remember having written the rest of the stuff. He has to assume that somebody else wrote those other things, or he wrote it when he was unconscious, because he can't remember, he hasn't got the capacity to remember writing those previous sentences. So it's really, really tragic, no doubt about it. It's complete tragic. But at the same time fascinating in a kind of lurid way, that that deprived of this ability to have a consistent memory which unites everything together, then what's kind of left? You know what I mean? This now that he lives in is a constant sequence of nows, and he's always in that moment. he's not in the kind of long now of long-term remembered experience. You know what I mean? Like when I say here I am now, it isn't like I'm not in the past. I can kind of feel the shadows of every moment leading up to this moment, as if I'm just kind of the front end of my being. You know what I mean? I know this is me. I know this is where I am. And I know this is the bit that kind of matters because this is the bit that gets hurt and stuff. But at the same time, I'm completely embodying large parts of my history, and my memory are just kind of coalesced around that sense. And he hasn't got that. He's just got this really thin slice of being that's just kind of moving like an old-fashioned tape head through a VHS tape, just playing this moment. Now I am really awake. So yeah, so it's that really. And that's sparking my interest in things like the relationship between this kind of thin slice of now that he lives in and the more extensive now that is common conscious experience, and what it is to be to have common conscious experience, and by analogy other kinds of relationships between those things. Because I think in a way, and I know I'm stretching this poetically probably beyond where it can go, in a way, in a sense, we all live kind of in our different moments of now, don't we? You know what I mean? I live the now that I live in, even if it's in the same time, kind of, that the now that you're in, we're in slightly different slices, or those slices are arranged at different angles or something, So even though you know what it's like to be conscious, and I know what it's like to be conscious, and we both have memories, and we probably have some memories in common, we probably watch the same TV shows, and we've probably been influenced by the same large events, Diana's death, or the 9/11, or whatever it may be. So we've got those things in common, but it doesn't feel like that. It feels like we're all these different little slices of slightly differently aligned moments of now, which of course leads me on to think, well, what would it be like if we didn't have this breakage? If somehow, imaginatively speaking, we as a collective human consciousness, hadn't suffered some weird accident or illness paralleling Clive Waring's that's kind of broken us apart. Does it make any sense to talk about that? I know that didn't really happen, by the way. Before you think I'm some kind of weird pantheist, panpsychist, and I know they're not all weird, But if I'm not going down the spiritual religious route here. It's just an imaginative exercise. But what would it be like if we had been kind of broken apart in that way? And what would it be like to get back together again? What would it be like if we said, now we are really awake? How is it make any sense to talk in those terms? In the same way that all the cells in my body also are kind of really awake. The cells in my body individually are asleep, kind of, and had independent existence, and most of them are falling off. Trillions of my blood cells are dying as I speak, and skin cells are being shed, and stomach lining cells are being shed constantly. But somehow, this collection, this community of cells is really awake, even though half of it's falling apart. It's in a constant state of mutation and falling apartness, and yet it's really awake. So what would it be like if we were all really awake? You and me and everybody else. We're kind of awake the way that skin cells are awake. And again, it's hard not to be theological about that. Maybe we're all moving towards what's it called, the omega point. No, I don't think so. But yeah, that's that. Quite interesting to me. Yeah, I suppose code. I'm thinking of computer code and the protocols of internet communication, because of course this is our YouTube video now, and it's one item and a lot of other items on YouTube, all connected by various protocols, all ultimately reducible to zeros and ones, moving around in various organized patterns, in at least paralleling ways in which my cells are moving around in organized patterns. And again, I'm not saying, and this isn't some claim for a science fiction future in which in which all these technology gets conscious and becomes like Skynet on the Terminator films. That's not what I'm talking about either, really. It's just an experiment, just a thought exercise. In a sense, we are kind of really awake, collective activities doing it. I mean, the nearest analogue, I don't think the nearest analogue to this actually is technological. I think the nearest analogue is currency, is the monetary systems. The monetary systems are pretty fucked, as we know, but I mean, the fact that there is this currency out there in the world, moving around, doing its thing, we have a tiny little, as individuals we have a very small amount of control over it, and even those people who've got an enormous amount of control over it, the George Soroses of the world, or the people who run the purse strings of governments, don't have all that much control over it. It kind of has a life of its own, you know, and you find that in mythological terms almost, in writings of people like Marx and what's he called, Wealth of Nations guy, Smith, Adam Smith. You know, Karl Marx talks about the invisible hand of the free market, I think he said, as if there's this kind of ghostly figure which is made up of all this activity, the flow of financial capital through people and institutions and objects and trade routes and all that kind of stuff. Invisible hand of the free market. And there's that guy, I think it was Smith, no, it wouldn't have been Smith, somebody else anyway, talking about the spectre of communism. This ghost, this spectre, this ghost that's kind of controlling the system in a slightly different way, slightly demonised, almost roboticised. I don't know. Anywho, hello world, you know, it's all that hello world stuff, isn't it? You know, all these systems kind of interrelate to one another and stack up and mutually potentiate and become more complex and create higher order abstractions and higher order representations, and those higher order representations react in the way, actually in the way that Antonio Damasio talks about in his new book about the mind. You know, how self comes to mind. You know, this all these little bits functioning together eventually manage to create that phenomenon, which is capable of saying things like, now I'm really awake, or hello world, or whatever, you know, spend. So yeah, that's the well, actually, yeah, the reason why I like writing it, I like writing the words, now I am really awake, just for this last thing, really. Just that, you know, when you do that, those words are made up of letters, and each letter is made up of little pen strokes, and the pen strokes, if you're writing by hand, you know, collate to form these little alphanumeric characters, and then the bunches of alphanumeric characters following certain kinds of protocols and certain laws of how languages work, clump together into words, and then those words function as holistic entities and clump together according to rules of grammar to form sentences. And the whole sentence then has a meaning of itself, you know, and that sentence says, now I am really awake. And if that was a long enough sentence, poor Clive Waring would have forgotten the beginning by the time he got to the end. Now I am really awake. Well, now we is really awake. Now I are really awake. Yeah, something like that anyway. Lots of stuff being written about that right now. Wikinomics. Here Comes Everybody, the Clay Shirky book, that's pretty good if you're into reading. We Think. It's probably others. Yeah, that'll do I think for now.